Hey, how's it going? My name is Jimmy. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm here with my Fuji XT2. I've been using this camera for quite a while and I still really like it and I recommend it. Let me know what camera you're using in the comments below. Perhaps your preferences have changed. Today we're talking a little bit about the AEL button and the AFL button and how they relate to the shutter button up here. We'll also demystify the idea of back button focusing. Perhaps you've heard that term and you're curious about it, or perhaps you know about it and you still don't understand how that could play a part in your photography. Make sure your front little ticker here is on the S. Make sure your aperture is on A, and your ISO is on A, your time value is on A, and your exposure compensation is on 0. We want to make sure we don't have any discrepancies as we go through the menu, and we do that by having very similar settings for this example. I'm going to go over a few definitions. AE stands for auto exposure, how bright or how dark your scene is at this time. And auto exposure on means it's activated. Yes, okay, I see how dark or how bright it is. And auto exposure lock means for as long as you hold down this button, it will remember and hold on to that exposure. No matter where you point the camera after, it remembers the initial measurement of that exposure. Same with autofocusing. The AFL button here, the way it's set to is autofocus lock. Autofocus on stands for focusing on a subject and it's focused. It turns on. It's noticing something. It goes beep beep and it's focusing. It's clear. Autofocus lock means for as long as you hold down to this button, it will lock it in place and you can move your camera a little bit just like auto exposure and it will kind of keep that subject still in focus. And that means recomposing your shot, right? If you focus on a person and you slightly move your camera a little bit so that person, for example, is now in the bottom left or right corner, he will or she will still be in focus. So you're recomposing the shot. And that's what autofocus lock and auto exposure lock allow you to do, to kind of recompose the shot while retaining original settings or original, the way things looked when you first activated the autofocus or auto exposure. I hope that makes sense. Now, when you press the half shutter button, it's doing this. So as for example, I'm going to turn on my camera, look at a subject, and it always helps to focus on something with a lot of light that's contrasting in color and make sure your focusing point is spacious, that can grab onto it. You can't really focus very easily on a clear blue sky. There's nothing to grab onto. So right now I'm focusing on this object in front of me. I'm going to half press the shutter button. I'm going to hold it there. So when I pressed it, it activated the focusing, right? It's clear. And then I also notice it's locking on exposure as well. So for as long as I'm holding down this shutter button, it's actually doing that. Auto exposure lock, auto focus lock. So you're saying, okay, that's what it does. Are you sure? Yeah, look at the bottom left hand corner of your screen right now. You see those two blue bars? AFL, AEL are also there. So if that's built into the shutter button, why do these buttons exist? And these buttons exist for flexibility's sake. You can change these buttons because they're called function buttons. Yes, they are labeled that way, but you can change them to do a vastly different function. But for right now, I recommend you leave them as they are. These are all buttons to give you flexibility. So that's why a lot of these buttons seem to do the same thing. So let's try an experiment right now. I'm going to focus on something with my shutter button by pressing halfway. I'm going to take my right thumb and while still holding down this shutter button, I'm going to press AFL. Now I'm going to let go of my shooter finger. Look at the left, bottom left part of the screen. It still says AFL. What is missing? The AEL, exposure lock. So as I move my camera around this office, notice the lightness and darkness is changing. It's kind of flickering on the screen because the exposure is not locked. Just focusing of that subject, the initial subject, is sort of locked, depending on how you stay close to where you were on your plane of focus. I'm going to let go of my thumb now. I'm going to half press the shutter button on something. I'm going to focus on it, and then I'm going to use my right thumb and hold down AEL, auto exposure lock. I'm going to let go of my shooter finger now and look what's left behind at the bottom left hand corner of the screen. EL, exposure lock. That's the button I'm pressing right now. So if I move my camera around, you'll see that the brightness and darkness, the exposure right now, is not changing. Perhaps the focus is though, because that's not locked. Okay, let's do one more very silly thing. I'm going to hold down the shutter button once more time, and I'm going to use my right thumb, hold down AFL, and then use my left thumb, hold down AEL, and then I'm going to let go of my shooter finger. Look what happens. The two, AFL and EL, are still engaged. They're locking on the exposure and the focusing. So that just tells you that's what these buttons do. Now that you've tried it, you see like, oh, these buttons aren't anything of a big deal. All they do is just kind of like breaking up what the shutter button does. If you want to just focus on exposure lock, how bright or how dark it is, and you can still move your camera around, you can do that. It's about recomposing the shot while still locking on the exposure that you initially liked and initially locking on the focus that you wanted. We now move on to the next point, back button focusing. What is back button focusing? Isn't necessary. I personally don't think so. I rarely use it. How do I focus? I do it just the way I showed you. I use my shutter button and I follow through and take that shot. Now, other people say it's not efficient. If you especially want to take pictures of people in the middle of sports or nature photography, you don't want to have to focus, take the picture. You're going to miss shots that way. But this is kind of a misconception. You're going to miss shots no matter what you do. It's just preference. So what are they saying? They're saying you should use these buttons to focus with your thumb. And when you focus with this, it goes beep beep, it focuses, right? And it locks automatically because you're holding on to it. And then you can go ahead and take that shot with your finger like this. So the only way to do this is to remove the autofocus and auto exposure lock from here. We're going to take that out and just make it a shutter button. And then make this AFL button here, make that the not autofocus lock, but autofocus on feature. And just by holding it after, it will lock naturally. Let's set your camera up for back button focusing. You may like it. Go to menu, and by pressing the menu button, press the left arrow. So now you're in that column, right? Press down to AFMF. This is autofocus manual focusing menu. You may think the AEL and AFL adjustments are here, and that's not the case. I think they actually kind of belong there, but that's not where they are. We want to change how these buttons work. So we're going to go down to the wrench. The wrench is the settings for the camera. We want to change how these buttons behave. So press the right arrow, go down to button dial setting. Press the right arrow, go all the way down. We're on page 1 of 3 right now. We're going to go to page 2 of 3. And on page 2 of 3, we see shutter auto focus, right? So our shutter right now, when we press down and it focuses, that's the autofocus, right? We want to take that auto-focusing function off the shutter. So press the right arrow here, and you see it says on for autofocusing. Press the right arrow again, go to off. So we're going to press display back. When you press a shutter button now, it won't go beep beep, it won't focus. We just removed that function. It will just take a blurry shot if you're not focused. So what do we use to focus now? We want to make this AFL button the focusing on button. So we're going to go up to the first page here again, press up again to FN, AEL, AFL button settings. That's a long way of saying, you see these two buttons here? We want to change them to do something else. These buttons, along with many buttons on your camera, are called function buttons. That just means they can do many things, a lot of things, but for right now, they're labeled this way: auto exposure, autofocus lock. So I use them that way. That's the way Fuji intended it, and by me changing it up will only confuse me later if I'm not really married to an idea, especially if I haven't mastered the way Fuji presented it. So if it says AFL, autofocus lock, let's keep it to autofocus, okay? So let's press the right arrow under function AEL, AFL, and then we're gonna go down to AFL. This is a picture map of all the function buttons. So every button you see on this menu can be changed to do a different function. Only thing we're going to do here is change the AFL. Press the right arrow and we're going to change the AFL to do something different. Press down arrow to AF on. Now just follow along here, press menu OK. What you did here is AFL does now what? It is now just autofocus on. Remember in the beginning of the video what I said? AF on means it just focuses on something. It turns it on. And if you hold it, then it becomes the lock. So it kind of does both now. If you look at AEL, the function button above, what is that set to? It's still auto exposure lock. Let's not change that right now. Let's just change one thing at a time. Half press the shutter button to go to live view. Now, as an experiment, press the shutter button. Does it focus? No, we took that function out. What focuses now? The AFL button is the focus button. Let's try that right now. Does that sound and look familiar? That is doing what the shutter button used to do. Now your thumb is doing back button focus. Quite literally. It's not some mystical thing. You're doing it. It's all it is just focusing with this button now. And now that it's focusing, your finger here is free to just slam the shutter button like this. And supposedly that'll give you the upper hand when you're doing nature photography, when you're taking pictures of your son playing hockey, for example. You know, follow them around, perhaps in conjunction with continuous focusing on your camera. I don't know. Everyone has different preferences. So that's pretty much it. That's back button focusing. And if you want to change that back, remember, go to the settings, the wrench in your camera, and you can easily change this shutter button to go back on for focusing, and then you can change the AFL back to autofocus lock. And I recommend trying the back button focusing for about a week and see if you like it. You can always go back. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps you. See you next time.